As we continue in our series on what it means to love our enemies in the middle of a cancel culture, we want to just recognize again and acknowledge that this is work that is happening at multiple levels in our society. And just to lift up the family of Daniel Prude and all that's going on in Rochester, trying to bring justice and peace and understanding and equity to the different corners of our country. This is going to be something we continue to struggle with and we grieve over for some time. And so I think it's really important that we continue to invest in learning about what it means to be peacemakers and people who love and how we practically love our friends and strangers and enemies. And so I'm thankful for this series, and I'm thankful to have a guest preacher with us this morning, teacher. This is somebody that most of you have met before. If you haven't, I'm happy to introduce him to you. But even if you have met him before, at least on Sunday mornings, you haven't met him in this exact way. And that is, I am introducing to you this morning, Nick Pickrell, who is a pastor, one of the most recent, if not the most recent, commissioned pastor in the Heartland Presbytery. He's the pastor of the Open Table going through commissioned pastor training, and Nick has been the leader of the Open Table along with Wendy Brockhouse and our residents and leadership team for 5 years now. He also is in the middle of going through spiritual direction training, and so through all of that, Nick brings a wealth of experience that I'm excited to hear his perspective and to bring that experience to bear on our sermon series this morning. So welcome, Pastor Nick.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. So like Paul said, I am Nick Pickrell. I am one of the co-pastors of the Open Table along with Wendy Brockhouse. We've been around about 5 years now. We turned 5 in March, and I just became a commissioned pastor in June, at the end of June.
Woo!
A few days before my birthday, so that was great. So a little bit about the Open Table. If you're unfamiliar, we are a dinner church. Normally, we are a dinner church. So now we are meeting virtually, and folks are more than welcome to eat, although that's not typically a part of our gatherings right now. And as we've gone along, as we've grown together as a community, we've become increasingly clear on what we wanted our specific charism to be. And we realized one of the things we wanted to focus on was becoming an actively anti-racist church. And to that end, about 2 years ago, we launched an anti-racism training business. And at this point, that business is about 2 years old, and we've trained at least 50 different organizations around Kansas City, totaling probably well over, 5,000 people. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying to do a community good and to help bring about justice in Kansas City, is by helping folks understand the ways that racism is harming us, and the ways that the way that racism is still existing today and how racism harms us. And so our goal is to help folks wake up to this and to begin to dismantle it so we can have more equitable systems in our society.
Well, Nick, as I said, we are talking about what it means to be followers of Jesus Christ and to try to obey his and follow his example of being called to love our enemies. And so I'd love to just hear from you what lessons you've learned, both from your spiritual direction training, but also from your anti-racism work now for 2 years of teaching this and trying to model this in your own life and community. What have you learned from that process of anti-racism training and spiritual direction that can apply to this idea of cancel culture and how we can be agents of reconciliation in a time when it's so easy just to kind of cancel each other out?
Yeah. So I guess being a Christian, maybe it makes sense for us to start in the scripture and look at the way that Jesus has handled these sorts of things. So there's a passage, let me see if I can pull it up here. Okay, so there's a passage that I'd love to read, and it comes from Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. And this is one of Jesus's many healing stories. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this, and then we'll unpack it a little bit. Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. A woman was there who had been disabled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and couldn't stand up straight. When he saw her, Jesus called her to him and said, "Woman, you are set free from your sickness." He placed his hands on her and she straightened up at once and praised God. The synagogue leader, incensed that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, responded, "There are 6 days during which work is permitted. Come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath day." The Lord replied, "Hypocrites, don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from its stall and lead it out to get a drink? Then isn't it necessary that this woman, a daughter of Abraham, bound by Satan for 18 long years, be set free from her bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said these things, all his opponents were put to shame, but all those in the crowd rejoiced at all the extraordinary things he was doing. So in this passage, we see Jesus pretty clearly calling out those in power. Jesus, like he did throughout his life and ministry, saw the ways that leaders were more concerned about law and order than about people. So he called it out very publicly. At the same time, Jesus cared an awful lot for the outsiders and the oppressed. He didn't, in fact, call them out. Instead, he welcomed them into this new community being formed, which became the church. So in this particular instance, Jesus noticed the woman who was doubled over because of some sort of sickness or arthritis, and he healed her and actually restored her to her community. But because it was the Sabbath, the leaders were irritated because Jesus was breaking Sabbath rest. And so in response, Jesus called out the hypocrisy of the Sabbath officials, and it undermined the authority of those Sabbath officials. The officials had their power diminished publicly. And the text says that the people without power absolutely loved it and cheered for Jesus, who stood up for them against this particular injustice. So Jesus was getting into what John Lewis would call some good trouble. Jesus, because he loved so well, he saw the injustice clearly and called it out, because that injustice was actually an obstacle to the kind of love and justice that Jesus's whole life and ministry was built on. So for us today, I think we can try to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. When the status quo is violent and causes harm, agitation, a little bit of agitation is needed to bring the injustice to light and to create conditions for change to happen. This kind of agitation obviously isn't very comfortable for those on the receiving end, but it's necessary in order for the harm to be acknowledged, reckoned with, and then healed.
Yes, I mean, this agitation thing obviously is kind of uncomfortable. And you mentioned here about Jesus kind of publicly calling out these religious leaders. I mean, they're in their turf, right? These are the Sabbath keepers, and Jesus calls them out. Which would have been embarrassing, agitating. But last week, I remember Jimmy McCarty, when he shared, talked about calling people in and calling people out. So I'm wondering if you can kind of help us distinguish a little bit between that, and maybe a helpful way to recognize when you call people in and when you call people out, and how do you make that determination?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, so as Jimmy was talking about last week, calling in obviously is rooted in relationship. Wrongs are acknowledged, and these conversations typically happen in private. Calling in is obviously a very restorative process that seeks to address the root issue of the conflict, but it also requires a little bit of energy and time to do things that way in particular. Calling out, on the other hand, also acknowledges the wrongs that have been done, but there can be less of a commitment or maybe no commitment to relationship. I mean, there can also be a full commitment to relationship, but that's a little bit of the difference. And then calling out also obviously happens in public settings.
Right.
And both are strategic moves when building a movement. And maybe this would be a helpful illustration. There's back when we were starting our anti-racism training group and we called together our cohort of 20 trainers, the person who trained all of us, her name is Paku Her, and she shared an illustration with us that I think could be helpful here. And the illustration is simply a pot of soup. So the status quo is like a pot of soup with no salt. So obviously, would you want that soup? Probably not. It's pretty bland, just like oppression. But when you salt the soup too much, like maybe you're just calling people out like crazy and that's all you're doing. If you salt the soup too much, nobody really wants to taste that soup. It doesn't taste very good. It's too salty. And oftentimes when you go that far, it can be difficult to remove the salt to make the pot of soup taste better. So as we think about which of these tactics we're going to be using, it's important that we use discretion to get the soup just right so it's tasty. So I think that's a helpful illustration. Hopefully it is. Because I'm sure all of us know some folks who do an awful lot of calling out without any calling in.
Yeah.
And so if you're calling out people all the time, you're probably not building community or building a movement. You're probably actually just isolating yourself. On the flip side, though, we can't give into the cult of niceness, because the cult of niceness is kind of like that bland soup, that saltless soup, because the cult of niceness is more concerned with assuring that no one gets their feelings hurt. And it comes actually at the expense of never addressing the root cause of the conflict.
But Nick, can I just interrupt? Can I interrupt?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, I mean, I think for some of us who grew up in tradition, trying to be good Christians in the Midwest, like if you had to sum up our Christianity, it is like, be nice. And so help me to understand that a little bit more, that this idea that niceness is maybe something that can get in the way of being a good Christian or following Jesus.
Yeah. So when I think of, so I do some conflict transformation training. And one of the things we talk about is conflict destroys community win and conflict builds community win. So one of the things that we say is conflict destroys community when we are solutions focused, meaning we just want to skip past the problem and get to the solution. And then whereas like conflict transforms a community and builds a community when we are process and problem oriented. And so this cult of niceness, this like oftentimes what it means is we just want to skip past the tension that comes with dealing with conflict and sitting with the tension of like, oh, some stuff has happened that has caused harm, and it is uncomfortable for some of us to sit with that and to reckon with that.
Okay.
And so yeah, hopefully that helps.
Yep.
Make a bit of a difference there. Yeah. And I can also say that like the way the calling in versus calling out or cancel culture stuff, the way it plays out in mass movements can be helpful to understand that. So like calling out is a tactic used to advance a particular goal, right? Maybe the person or system being called out has sexually harassed or abused someone. Maybe they aren't living up to a campaign promise. Maybe they've laundered money or done some other unethical or exploitive act. So calling out is meant to actually force that person or persons with power back to the negotiating table or to the negotiating table in the first place. Because oftentimes folks in power don't necessarily want to have that challenged, or as we all know, systems don't necessarily want to just change. Systems don't necessarily change themselves oftentimes.
Right. Well, like the religious leaders in the passage you read, like, what are you doing? You don't do that.
Yeah, totally. So calling out is a tactic used to create pressure so that the demands of the people will be met and hopefully the injustice will be stopped. Whereas like calling in is like what we do with our friends, our coworkers, our family members, and that kind of thing. And this is more long-term work that hopefully moves the person from being an opponent to an ally. It's focused on conversion away from doing harm and conversion towards becoming an ally, especially to impacted or oppressed peoples. And obviously, if there is no change of behavior after repeated conversations, it might be time to consider calling the person out, especially if they're directly causing harm to others. So that's a little bit of the way I would.
Yeah, that helps, and I think all of us probably can attest to the fact that calling somebody out who's kind of a close friend typically doesn't have the best results. That if you can try to find ways to draw the circle around that person and to find ways that you can continue to develop relationship there, if you can, if it's a safe space, then that's more important. as we've been working through this, I'm thinking about, as a nation, I'm thinking about my own kind of stages of realization of things, and just how fired up I get about stuff. And when I was thinking about when I was in late high school and college, and kind of realizing for the first time how much the kind of the male voice dominated not just pulpits, but also, you know, the people who were teaching at school, and especially in the university level, and recognizing in my own self as a football player and baseball player and stuff, the level of macho-ness within the male culture that was really kind of harmful to other men, but to women and everybody. And I remember just getting really angry about that, and really kind of being pretty vocal about my anger and frustration with kind of macho culture. And I probably wasn't the most gracious about it. And so I think about like America, where we are as a country. And I think for some people, we're just kind of waking up to, there's kind of an adolescent awakening to inherent racism in our country, and recognizing what that means, that it's seeped into the systems, that there's our history of oppression, and building this country on the backs of others, has really seeped into everything that we do. But when you become aware of that, you tend to get pretty fired up, and so people end up making pretty sweeping generalizations about whether it's a race or a party or a profession. And you see stuff tagged on the wall, and you see what people are saying on social media. Like we want to just cancel an entire view or entire other group, because we become so convinced when we have these realizations that our way is right, and clearly their way is wrong. And so, you know, how do we deal with kind of these sways in our collective consciousness, and how we tend to maybe sometimes overreact?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so if we're not careful, I mean, what you spoke to there, I think speaks of the tendency to go from one fundamentalism to another. And so I think that's a very common thing, especially for folks as we wake up to something new. And it makes sense, because we wake up to an injustice, we end up getting really excited or convicted about the issue. So we end up taking a deep dive into it. Like it reminds me of Peter, whenever Jesus was washing the disciples' feet, and Peter's like, you're not going to wash my feet. And then Jesus says some words to him. He's like, okay, well, you're just going to wash all of me. And Jesus is like, okay, can we just calm down for a second? Like, let's just take a breath. Just take a breath. So like, as this new information begins to reshape us, like our whole worldview starts to shift, right? And we end up renegotiating our boundaries with friends, with family, and how we relate to the world. Especially with something like waking up to something like racism or sexism or any of these isms. It's like, whoa, I'm seeing these things for the first time. And so this is all part of the process of building a new framework for how we see the world. But in the midst of this process, there's a book that I read called Boundaries by Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend. And they talk about how in the midst of this worldview changing process, we enter into this phase called the obnoxious phase. So for instance, whenever I became a Christian, I immediately wanted to save everyone. I became pretty zealous in my desire to convert the world. And that also included my parents. So I was actually obnoxious in the midst of doing this. Like there were plenty of times where like I overstepped boundaries and those kinds of things, because I was just so excited and I really wanted everybody to be safe. So it's a phase we all go through as we shift and change. So it's important for us just to recognize that that's a thing. The temptation, especially when something's new, is for us to maybe become the most woke or have the most perfect analysis. And what can happen is we end up weaponizing our newfound knowledge. And this, unfortunately, can do some real damage. And the reality is there is no perfect analysis. Like in the instance of racism, we had both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Both had different tactics on how to dismantle racism. And both did tremendous good. So this seeking of some mythical perfect tactic or analysis will generally lead to a weaponizing of our newfound knowledge, and then we end up shaming others with it. So many times I think this weaponizing probably comes from an insecurity that we have because we're new to this particular worldview or position. And I think the insecurity comes from a fear, knowing that we're on shaky ground because we're in this time where we're feeling very disoriented. We're trying to build a new solid foundation underneath our feet. And we fear what would happen if the ground gives way before we have the chance to solidify our worldview, because we're in this kind of tender place.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And for me, that's what makes community so important. That's what makes being a part of a Christian community and having people who are older than me and people who have been around and people from different experiences who have lived through some pains and some realizations long before I did and can help to bring some balance. And so that's, another reason why I continue to want to be a part of a church and want to be a part of a community that can help to hold me and to give kind of, as they say, kind of sand down some of my sharp edges and provide some examples. And so I'm thankful for that. That makes sense to me. I'm curious, as you've walked through this process. Clearly, you are a white male, well educated, and you've had certainly some privilege in your life. I'm curious what you've learned about why it is that some of us seem to be triggered by and so frustrated by cancel culture. What's that about?
Yeah, so I think I'll get to it here in a roundabout way, but I want to kind of start out with this. So Sarah, my partner, and I were in the midst of this spiritual director training program. We've got like under a year left, and then we start seeing clients for spiritual direction. And at this program called Sojourners, one of the things, there are a couple of learnings that came from there. I'll just say that. So growing up, I realized I was taught to not trust myself. So because of like my own religious background, there was this body bad, spirit good kind of thing. You can't trust the heart, those kinds of things. And so because of that, I actually abandoned myself. So what that set me up for is I was looking only to exterior input for knowing how to orient myself. So I was looking to others to understand who I was. And that's all I did because I was taught to abandon myself. So at Sojourners, we learn from, like the Desert Mothers and Fathers, the monastics and other Christian mystics throughout time that many of these folks advocated for two things. One was non-dualistic thinking, and one was knowing oneself as a way to know God. So the inward work that we get to do is to learn to accept who we are, which is a way of getting to know ourselves. And as we do that, we may find that we become better able to separate out who we are from what we do. So this is where I think hopefully I'm responding to your question. So when challenged, we tend to get defensive, kind of like the Sabbath officials,
right,
in our scripture, right? So this is rooted in what we perceive to be a character attack. So someone says something I said or did was wrong or maybe racist. And because I don't think I am wrong or racist, like I end up repelling what the other person says. And why is that? It's because I'm hearing that they are calling me a bad person.
So that's the dualistic thinking. That's, you're either calling me
Yeah.
good or bad, or that's what you're.
Correct.
Yeah,
correct. Yeah, because it's this good, bad binary kind of thing. So we have to separate ourselves from that of thinking like you're either for me or against me. I think we've heard that said from former president, you're either for us or you're against us, or like the good, bad binary, good, bad kind of thing. So instead, it's a lot better for us to figure out who we are and what we value, and acknowledge that, who I am and what I do sometimes doesn't line up. Like Paul talks about that in the New Testament, where he talks about like, I do what I don't want to do, like this kind of thing. So we recognize that who we are and what we do sometimes don't line up. And this could happen either intentionally or unintentionally. So if we're able to do this though, we're going to be way better equipped to receive criticism when it's needed, especially when we're making things like sexist remarks, racist remarks, homophobic remarks. Because, I mean, the reality is we've all got blind spots, and none of us are perfect. So, so for me, I think we would be best served to begin to get to know ourselves, to accept ourselves, and to understand that sometimes our actions don't line up with who we know ourselves to be. And I think that will open the door for us to be able to receive criticism.
That's helpful. Thank you. The other thing that I think I've come to realize, because my initial response to kind of cancel culture and some of the stuff that I'm seeing happening is pretty, I'm not a fan, because I think it does break down dialogue and such. But the more I've thought about it, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, sometimes the people that are the most frustrated by cancel culture are the people that have been used to having the voice and being able to control the narrative and having a platform on which to speak. And yet I realize if we kind of open this metaphor up a little bit, there are entire groups of people who have felt unheard or dismissed from various systems and opportunities, and literally been kind of canceled as an entire group. And that's not me. You know, I walk into spaces and I feel like I've kind of got rights and authorities. I'm not worried if I see a cop car in my back window. I'm not worried when I, walk down the street. So some people have been canceled for decades or centuries without even realizing it. And yet there are some of us who have benefited and kind of been uncanceled for so long. I don't know if there's a question in that, but I'm wondering if that cancel culture intersects with our whiteness and folks, people of color in our country, and how that all works together at a larger level.
Yeah, no, that's good. There's some stuff that you've got me thinking about here. So I do think that those of us who've benefited from the systems in our country, and by that I'm meaning like those of us who have relatively easy time accessing the resources we need in order to live, and have access to various forms of power that we need in order to ensure that we continue to have what we need to live. So those of us who have benefited from the systems in our country, like, it's important for us to recognize that it's, especially around the issue of racism, we need to develop thicker skin. And, since before our country was founded, Black folks, Indigenous folks, and other non-Black people of color, like, they've been canceled. Like well before the 90s, whenever the R. Kelly stuff was happening, like this modern iteration of cancel culture, like BIPOC folks, which is the acronym for Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color, they've been canceled economically, politically, culturally, and physically, like with lynchings, mass incarceration, forced relocation, and genocide, and on it goes. So this is the history of cancel culture in the States. And because us white folks have grown up not having our own norms and access challenged, it can be difficult to make sense of all the criticism that seems to be coming now. So you've got from things like appropriation, with the conversations that are happening around whether or not the Kansas City Chiefs should change their name, to locker room talk, or to racist jokes, or other forms of racism as it shows up. Like many dominant culture folks haven't had these behaviors challenged, but these behaviors have in fact been doing damage to people who are part of the non-dominant culture group for a long time. So what happens in society is that the dominant group typically has their cultural norms and values and identities normalized and universalized out, and then it gets invisibilized. And so what do I mean by the invisibilized piece? So an example would say that a lot of times we don't end up saying, when we're talking about friends, I'm speaking as a white person, whenever I'm talking about friends, I don't typically say my white friend, I just say my friend. And why is that? And it's because that's just assumed, it's been invisibilized. But we'll say things like, oh, my Black friend, or maybe my Latinx friend, or what have you. So everyone who falls outside of what is deemed to be the norm is labeled abnormal, when in reality, there are many ways of being in the world that are all equally valid. So what we're seeing now, I think, are groups of people who are standing against the values, the norms, and the stereotypes that have caused harm to them. So if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, anti-hate groups, disability right groups, interfaith groups, pro-LGBTQIA groups, like all of these groups have emerged precisely because they have been deemed abnormal and have been excluded from accessing the resources they need, excluded from accessing the power they need to have agency over their lives, excluded because people think their cultural norms or worldviews are abnormal or maybe even sinful. So, I think I would say that in that way, like we as white folks probably need to be okay, like more okay with cancel culture, especially as it's aimed at various institutions and systems that have done harm and continue to do very real violence. And I say this because, like, as white folks, again, like I've said this probably a number of times, we're just not used to being criticized in these sorts of ways, and we don't know how to respond out of anything other than defensiveness. So it's important for us, like we need to acknowledge the ways that our presence can actually be causing harm to others, even if we don't realize it. So, you know, some small examples would be like from taking up too much space in a room to making crude jokes at the expense of a non-dominant culture group. Like we need to learn how to be able to receive feedback.
Yeah.
And another thing that I would say about cancel culture would be like, let's just think about an issue when it comes to cancel culture. Like the Me Too movement, as an example. That movement is shifting the conversation from forcing people who have been abused to prove that it happened in the first place, to now we're seeing the burden falling more and more on the one who did the abusing, right? So this Me Too movement like has started to shift that around. And so in the process, we have been learning to trust the ones without power in that scenario.
Right. Believe the woman before you disagree or you try to explain it away.
Yeah. But now let's switch it to something else. What about the harassment and killing of unarmed Black people by the police? Do we view this in the same sort of way? Are we calling for the police to prove their innocence? Or does that burden fall on the person who was harassed or killed?
Yeah.
And so I think our responses to each of these can reveal maybe where we have a little bit of work to do. It can reveal where we maybe have like sexist or racist narratives or socializations that are kind of lingering under the surface. Because I think like the reality is both the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movements are cries for justice precisely because justice has not come for them.
Right.
So it's important to understand like how we're picking and choosing when we engage in calling out or cancel culture, or when we're taking a different route. Because if we respond to one with we need to believe the victim, but then change the color of someone's skin, and suddenly our refrain becomes wait till all the facts come out, or he should have complied, like that should probably cause us to do a little bit of reflecting.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's a helpful comparison. We've talked about a lot, and we need to kind of wrap up here. But I'm wondering if you've got a something concrete that would help us to get our minds around this a little bit, a tactic that we can use to understand how to maybe call people in, call people out when that's the loving thing to do.
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna put. Please don't click on this now. You don't necessarily need to click on this now, but this is the article that I'm referencing, and I'm gonna share my screen here. Right here. Okay. So obviously it's important for us to be oriented like Jesus. At the end of the day, you know, we are Christians. It is important for us to be oriented like Jesus. So I think a helpful illustration is something that can help us out with this is something called ring theory. Now I'm using it in a different way than what you will see it is being used in the LA Times article, but I think there's a lot of overlap here. So this illustration is something that I picked up from a recent racial justice meeting with the Missouri Organizing and Voter Engagement Collaborative, or MOVE. So this tool is typically used to ensure that impacted persons have space to fully express their frustration, their emotion about like the trauma they have endured without having to worry about others not connected to the trauma, like making it about them or devaluing the impacted person's experience.
Right.
But I do think this works with our discussion of calling in and calling out. So the basic concept is this: in every situation we find ourselves in, it's important to understand like where we fall on the ring. So in the middle would be like the impacted or oppressed person. The next ring out would be someone close to that impacted person, someone who's still close to the trauma. And the further out you go, the less and less connected to the person impacted you are.
So tying this into our scripture for this morning.
Yeah. So, so the way we would tie it in, let me get one more quick thing out, and then okay. I'll tie it in here. So the idea is that wherever you are on the ring, like, you're supposed to only be offering comfort and support to those closer to the center, as they are the ones who are closer to the injustice and the trauma. But we can definitely call in or call out those who are on the same ring as us or further out than us. So to take it to the scripture from this morning, at the center is the woman who was doubled over. She had some sort of illness, which led to her experiencing life as an exile within her own community. She was a woman living in a patriarchal structure, and she was part of an oppressed group under Roman occupation. Jesus was also part of the same oppressed group living under Roman occupation, but he was a man and he was a rabbi. So Jesus was a couple circles out from the impacted person in the story. So in comes the Sabbath officials who are in positions of authority to enforce things like the Sabbath law. These folks would be way out on the circle. So how does Jesus handle the situation? He comforts and supports the woman experiencing the oppression. So that's him comforting and supporting the person who is impacted. And then he calls out the Sabbath officials, who are the ones with the power, who would be some circles out from even Jesus.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes sense. And I think this can be helpful because I see a lot of white folks, I guess, to take it back to today, and the uprisings that are happening because of the deaths of like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and et cetera. I see a lot of white folks wanting to police how Black folks are fighting for their freedom. And I think it's largely unhelpful. Because what we're doing as white folks is we're doing the whole armchair quarterback thing. And it actually is kind of an excuse to not practice solidarity as the oppressed group, which is unfortunate because as Christians, we have lots of calls throughout the scriptures to be in solidarity as the oppressed, right? Like there's 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where it says, if one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. And to put it another way, Fannie Lou Hamer, famed civil rights activist, said nobody's free until everybody's free. So there's this sense that we're all in this together. So to zoom out and for us to close out here, I think cancel culture can be productive when it's a group without power calling out a group with power, or an impacted person calling out a group with power, or people with lesser power calling out people with more power. So I think you get wonky though when people with power start canceling impacted groups, or when people with limited power start canceling one another. In the US, like white folks and dominant culture folks have plenty of resources, get plenty of airtime, get plenty of second chances, while BIPOC folks aren't generally afforded the same, don't get plenty of resources, don't get plenty of airtime, don't get second chances. So I'm okay, I think, if some folks with power and resources get called out or canceled because of some heinous act that they did. Like, I don't know, because it's like we've gone too long as a country letting those in power off the hook while throwing the book at oppressed groups. Yeah, but I would say, like, on a personal level, I'm someone who strives to balance both calling out and calling in. Like, I know that my own silence causes violence, so I'm committed to speaking up when racist, sexist, and homophobic things are said. But I'm also committed to maintaining relationships that I have. So I try to extend grace. I believe in forgiveness, but I also recognize that reconciliation is a longer road, because trust can be broken and forgiven, but folks still need to do better. Like, that's part of the issue, right? We need to do better. Otherwise, violence continues to happen. And we follow a God who is about justice and reconciliation.
Yeah, this is all very helpful, Nick. Thank you for the work that you've done and kind of pulling this all together. And I think we probably need to need to close here and send folks into groups for just a little bit. But I thought maybe before we did, as Nick and I were sharing about this sermon and this topic and such, you know, I thought about times just in the last few years where I have been embarrassed, whether I was teaching a class or I was doing something, and people either gave me a phone call afterwards or even raised their hand in the middle of my class. I was teaching a history of the church kind of thing, and talking about the trajectory of the church, and I had a room full of people and the things that we've gone through and how the church was really kind of growing up until the 40s. And then we had the Second World War, and church attendance started dropping off. And so I kind of had this growing influence and growing advance in society that was happening until kind of things started falling apart in the middle of the 20th century. And this woman raised her hand and she said, I think you've missed something. And I was like, what do you mean? It's like, well, there's a big chunk of history you didn't really talk about, and it hasn't felt like an advance. And this woman was a woman of color, and she said, you didn't mention anywhere, you didn't mention slavery, you didn't mention Jim Crow, you didn't mention lynching. And I was literally standing in front of a classroom of people, and I felt the blood rush to my face, and I wanted to defend myself, I wanted to explain, but I really just kind of stammered, and I said I was sorry. It was agitating, it was embarrassing, it was humiliating, and I was thankful that afterwards, the woman who raised her hand, who did that, we had a chance to talk, and she was very gracious in calling me in. But what I've heard you say in this whole thing is we have got to allow ourselves to feel the discomfort and not just want to bring in whatever it's law and order or defensiveness or get things back. This pain is real, and it needs to be shared and felt. So Nick, thank you for that. Thank you for the way it's impacted my life, and I hope it impacts those who have heard. I wonder if you've got a kind of a closing comment or so for all of us before we head into breakout groups.
Yeah, without a doubt. I'm putting something else in the chat here. It's a great Instagram post that talks a little bit about cancel culture and how to like navigate it. So feel free to click on that in your spare time. But I would say as people who try to follow Jesus, like it's important to remember that we are a people who are committed to forgiveness and reconciliation. So canceling while bringing justice to folks who haven't gotten justice on a particular issue, it can also cause division without the possibility of restoring the community when used inappropriately. So in any instance of canceling or calling out, or if we're being called in or called out, it's important to remember that we are being called to do better. It's important to remember that even those doing damage are victims of the same system that have divided us. So It's important to look at ways that we could acknowledge the wrong, seek justice, and figure out how to restore and heal the community. Because when we do this, we're going to be known as, Isaiah says, those who can fix anything, restore old ruins, rebuild and renovate, make the community livable again.
Amen. Amen. May God give us the strength to continue